Welcome back, listeners. This is Alex Arabian with Shattering Superstructure. After a brief hiatus, we have film composer extraordinaire Jason Lazarus, who discusses Skull Island, The Gates, two projects, one animated, one live-action horror, two very different, exemplifying his amazing range as a composer and as a musician. We talk about his career, his influences, and what's next for him, as well as, the usual detours in the conversation that are quite fascinating, such as music theory, a little bit about the process of working on a film, which I find incredibly fascinating from a composer's perspective, because it's a whole different beast, but it's all part of the cog and the system, the puzzle piece that fits the larger tapestry of a film that is always a team sport. So it's really an inside look into that process. It was great talking with Jason, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks, listeners. Without further ado, here's Jason Lazarus. So I'll say my last recent score I listened to, and then I want to ask a similar question for you. It was Max Richter's Ad Astra score, the James Gray film. I thought that was really powerful. And I love Max Richter in general. And I'm not sure if he's one of those guys who moved from making his own music to film score, or he started doing film scores and then started making his own soundtracks. I don't know if it was if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, Max Richter's in the camp of kind of like a neoclassical musician, neoclassical artist is kind of the term for that. And I don't know if he started scoring films before he started releasing his own material, but it's a lot of neoclassical, like modern neoclassical, is very much it sounds like film music. It's very evocative of visuals and cinema, and it's not angular to the sense of like a lot of modern concert music like Schoenberg's a classic example, but or Xenakis or something like that, where it's actually like it's pleasant to listen to. So I can't speak to his specific trajectory, but it's like that lane of artistry. There's another person in that camp is the late Johan Johansson, brilliant composer.
Brilliant.
But his records, his solo records are in that vein of neoclassical, where it's like you listen to them on your own, and it's like this could be a film score.
Yeah. I love him too. I was just crushed to hear when he passed away so young.
Yeah, it was really, really sad. His last score is actually one of my favorites. It's the Mandy score. That was the last score he completed. And it's fantastic score, and very, very fun film.
Yeah, I remember that very well. It's memorable. When did you decide that you wanted to make music in a visual medium?
That's a good question. It kind of just happened naturally. I had been a musician, all through high school. And then when I got to college, I kind of didn't really have, I was thinking a little too practically, and like, oh, that's a fun hobby, but like now it's time to like get serious and learn how to like get the skills to get a real job and become an adult and that whole thing. So I started school as a business economics major at UCLA, but I was spending all my time playing music. I was not interested in the course material, and I was just spending all my time smoking weed and playing music. And at a certain point, I kind of had the realization that like, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm interested in. I might as well just do this. Otherwise I'm not going to be happy. And it's what I'm spending my time doing anyway. So I and just by happenstance, my roommate freshman year at UCLA was in the UCLA theater program, which is a very, very small program. I think there were like 40 kids in the program or something like that. So just all the kids that I was hanging around with were actors, directors, writers, people on that side of the visual medium. And then so I was always the musician that was hanging out with all the theater kids and all the actors, and all the directors and the writers. So I would actually say the how I started writing music for visual medium is we started an improv troupe in college. We were called the Wait List. And so there was a very, very small improv theater in Westwood called, at the time it was called Ultimate Improv, and then it changed its name to the Improv Space. And I don't know what it's called now or if it's even still there. But we would perform the Wait List every Thursday nights. It was our slot at Ultimate Improv and then the Improv Space, and I would improvise music live to the scenes. So I wasn't playing the entire time, but the improvisers would be on stage, the actors would be on stage, and at a certain point when the scene hit a moment where there was a defining moment in the scene, whether it was a romance or some bomb was dropped and it got really tense, I would then start improvising on guitar and essentially live scoring the scene. So I guess in a way that's how I started writing for film or for visual medium. And then that must have been sophomore or junior year of college. And by this time I had understood that I really wanted to write music for a living. So I started teaching myself classical composition in order to get into the composition program at UCLA. Very long story short, ended up getting into the program my final year. And because I had already had those connections with filmmakers and actors, by this time people had started making short films. So I started scoring short films while I was in college. And then another big thing that happened to me while I was still in school is I took a class from a composer named Joe Trapanese, who was very, very young at the time. He was, I think, 24, 25. And he had just finished collaborating with Daft Punk on the Tron score. So he'd orchestrated it, but that hadn't come out yet at this point. So he had just finished his graduate work at UCLA. I'm an undergraduate at UCLA. He comes back as an adjunct professor to teach a class. I took that class. The class was I forget the name of the class. It was like electronic composition or something like that. It was basically just learning the basics of Logic, Apple's Logic Pro. I took the class. I was his best student. We developed a relationship. And then as soon as I graduated, his career was starting to take off and he needed help with his project. So I was his first call, and we have been working together I officially started working for Joe in 2012, and have since kind of moved on and started doing my own thing. But we still work together on projects. So that was a big moment for me in getting my foot in the door, and just getting to be there and actually doing the thing.
That's incredible. And I'm scoring improv, like it's got to keep you on your toes.
Oh yeah.
So I'm wondering if like that, helped inform your process later on. Like when you're watching a scene, do you get something off the top of your head? That's a little improv, and say, "Oh, this is good. I'm going to keep it in."
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most importantly, what it helped me develop was understanding the important moments in a scene, understanding what a scene is about, understanding the nature of the relationship of the characters in the scene. Those were the skills that was developed during those time. And obviously just being able to improvise musically, that's a whole other can of worms. But in terms of this specific medium, scoring to film, those were the skills that were really developed, was just like understanding what is the scene about, what are the important moments in the scene, and whose perspective are we following or are we playing to.
And also like themes, right? What's the thematical through line, which
Yeah.
I'm sure with improv can change quite a bit depending on the scenario. Um, and how many instruments do you play, or at least are adept
Oh
at?
God, I can I can kind of pick up anything and make noise on it and like fake my way to it. I'm decent at guitar. You might be able to see I've got a few surrounding by me. I spend most of my day in front of a keyboard, but like I'm not a keyboardist. I'm not a piano player. It's just the easiest medium with which to interact with the computer, which is where the writing is getting done. So spend a lot of time on keyboards, which you can kind of see in the frame. I've got guitars. I was a brass player in high school, although I haven't really pulled out. That's kind of brass instruments are kind of a family of instruments that if you don't keep up with it, you kind of like lose. I could pick up a trumpet and play some very basic stuff and have it sound okay, but after 10 minutes, my lips are done. Like I can't hang
Yeah.
anymore. But luckily for what I do, you don't have to be a very good musician. You just have to write this stuff, and you can hire other people to play it that are way way better than you are. And obviously it definitely helps to be a musician getting into this field, but it's you don't have to be a competent virtuosic whatever musician in order to be successful at writing music.
Right. I mean, I think perhaps that's why, a lot of composers utilize like full orchestras to realize their vision. I mean, obviously they can't do it all themselves. Not to say that they aren't good musicians, but it seems to me like filmmaking that it's a collaborative process as much as, the way directing, producing, acting, and the crew works, right?
Oh, it is the most collaborative art form. I don't think there's anything else that is more collaborative of an art than filmmaking.
Yeah, 100%. I always call it a team sport. Um, and what are some of your, let's start with filmmaking influences?
I mean, I grew up. You're wearing one of my favorite films right now, Jurassic Park.
Oh yeah.
It might be my favorite film, but it's definitely up there. I grew up in the watching films in the like the mid the 90s, essentially into the early 2000s. So Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones, Star Wars, like a lot of Spielberg. Um, and then in terms of modern filmmakers, huge fan of Paul Thomas Anderson. I'm there seeing There Will Be Blood when I was in college, like left a big
Mm,
mark on me. That is also one of my favorite films, and also Johnny Greenwood's score to that film. Just I remember
mm.
it it moved me in ways. No, it stuck with me, and it's something I think about a lot. And then recently, I've gotten really into horror, and everything Ari Aster does is incredibly fun to watch. And you got a bunch of comedy guys
Mhm.
shifting into horror, which is a whole other conversation. But I have theories onto why that's a great thing. But Jordan Peele's movies are great. Zach is it Kreger or Kruger? From Whitest Kids You Know, just directed Barbarian, which is fantastic.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Uh, it'll just turn into a laundry list of
Yeah.
fantastic direct. Stanley Kubrick's movies are amazing. It's like name. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of film in general, but those are some of the first ones that come to mind.
That's awesome. And like, okay, music, artist, composer, or film score influences.
Um, yeah, that's tough. I would say in terms of film score and influences where I'm at right now, I Hans Zimmer is fantastic. People have a lot of feelings about his style of writing and the way he runs his businesses, but it's I cannot think of forget film composers. I cannot think of another musical artist who is continually getting more relevant as he gets further into his career, and is doing continually better and better work as he gets further into his career. And I'm a fan of musical simplicity and economy, and he is a master of that. These beautifully epic and powerful scores are so simple, and that's something that a lot of people that's kind of a loaded statement. They're very complex in how they're put together, but the actual musical statements and musical language are very simple. The melodies are very simple, which is one of the ways it makes it so effective. And that takes a lot of restraint, and that takes a lot of taste. And one of the things I've seen with people who are competent musicians, who are very good at instruments, know a lot about music theory, it's hard to do something simple and effective, because you can do so much more. And just writing a melody with 2 notes or with 3 notes feels like it's just counterintuitive to someone who's so overly trained in music. And the amount of restraint and taste and trying to think of another adjective in that same vein, but it's just he's definitely like a big influence, and he's someone that I admire, whose body of work I admire, and such range too.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, were you gonna say something?
No, go for it.
So yeah, definitely Hans is a big influence. I'm a huge fan of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross and everything that they put out, for different and similar reasons. It's just they are examples of they have a thing, and they have taste, and when a score is by them. And a lot of people emulate it and don't get it quite as, they are the only ones that are going to be able to do that thing as well as they do. And again, the range they play on emotional range. That's why I'd say that their scores are very identifiable as them, but the range of emotion that they go from very intimate and sparse and heartfelt to just, on the 9 Inch Nails spectrum, very aggressive and in your face. It's just, I love seeing that dichotomy in artists. And that's something that I try to play with as well. We mentioned Johan Johansson, fantastic composer. Yeah, it's interesting. John Williams, I listened to John Williams music a lot growing up, obviously, with listening to all these classic films. But he's one of those composers that that is his sound. And there are people that are able to do things similar. Michael Giacchino is the first one that comes to mind, but it's never going to be John Williams. And if you want that sound, I guess John Williams is in his 90s now, so unfortunately he's not going to be around forever. But if you want that sound, that's John Williams is the person to do it. And other people is just going to be it's just not going to be the same thing. But there are a lot of very straight orchestral composers that do very good work. Michael Giacchino, Alexandre Desplat, Alexander or Alexandre, I'm not sure. Don't.
I think it's Alexander.
Alexander?
Could be mistaken. Yeah.
John Powell does very very effective orchestral based scores. Kind of more in that traditional thing. He kind of bridges the traditional to the modern, but no, this is also gonna turn into a laundry list. Non-film composers. I grew up listening. There's a band called Refused, which is a post-hardcore band. I don't know if you're familiar. Do you know Refused?
I don't think so. No.
They're a Swedish post-hardcore band. They came out with a record called The Shape of Punk to Come in 1998, and it's just very aggressive post-hardcore punk music. And I loved that record when I was in high school. And I've written a lot of action music, more driving, and I've kind of realized retroactively so much of my sensibilities and how I bring aggression and rhythm is derived from that early influence of refused. The way they use syncopations and the way the guitars play off the drums and whatnot. It's like, oh, I'm just essentially doing that orchestrally a lot of the time.
That's awesome. Um, to your point, I think simplicity is, yeah, there's a time for it, which is more often than not, I think, in film. Like the tendency is to make it really, really dense, right? Because, like you said, it feels counterintuitive. But like when I think of simplicity, I think of John Williams, and not in a bad way, but it's like the fifth jumps and the just like the major to minor shifts, and I mean, there's nothing too complex about it, but it's just so perfect to each
Oh,
film, and it's
I beg to differ. The harmonic language that John Williams uses is very, very complex a lot of times. Like you can break the components into like simple terms, but the way even just the Jurassic Park theme, like the that melody. Oh God, I'm gonna sound like an idiot now, but he dun, 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 dun,
yeah,
ba-da-da, like you're moving up a whole, you know, you're starting on what sounds like the tonic, but then you move up a whole step. So you're actually, oh, maybe this is like a 4 to 5 switch, and then it's like the melody has the sharp five in it, and it's just but it sounds so natural. But it's like when you actually look at it on its face, it's a very complex melody over an unexpected chord progression.
wow, you're right. Yeah, yeah, that's incredible.
Um,
And the
on
melodies
that sim-
sometimes almost make it sound simple, but like they're way more, like you're saying, they're way more complex than actual song.
and
Yeah.
that is the mark. That is the mark to me of someone who's a master at what they do. Is they you know, you think about an athlete, oh, they made that look easy. Like John Williams, he made that sound easy, but it's like it's actually, you know, tell someone else to write a melody with those components, and it's going to sound like a mess.
Right.
Here on Simplicity, this is a podcast, so it's going to be great. This is the background of my phone. I don't know if you can recognize what it is, but this is the Picasso bull reduction.
Oh,
And this
wow.
is something, this has been the background. Uh, this has been the background of my phone. You can look this up so you can see it better. But it's basically this exercise was Picasso. It's all these different cells, and on one end you have a drawing of a bull, like a pretty, you know, it's not photorealistic, but it's a detailed drawing of a bull.
Mm,
And as you move through the cells in the progression, the exercise is trying to find like what is the fundamental essence of bull?
mm,
Like what is the least amount I can do and it still is a bull? And
mm.
when you get to the final cell, it's, I don't know, eight eight lines, 10 lines, something like that. It's very, very simple. It's just an outline with a few little details, but it's still a bull. And that's something that I try to I tend to notice that my ideas are overly complex at the beginning, and then I try to find the essence of them and start pulling it away and pulling it away and pulling it away till I get like, okay, here is the actual core idea of what I'm trying to do. And if necessary, I can build that back up. But it's been so helpful for me to try to reduce whatever I'm doing to that essential form, and then use that as the building block to take it somewhere else, as opposed to that initial idea that I put down.
That's fascinating. I love that metaphor of the reduction. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. When you put it in those terms, painters you've mentioned composers, filmmakers, and I feel like every artist, it's kind of like that. Like it's always an amalgamation of your pop culture or artistic tastes, no matter what medium you work in. You know.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, too, it's all communication. It's all just different mediums of communication. It's you're communicating an emotion, you're communicating an idea, communicating a feeling, and it's like you can do that. You can do that through a visual medium. You can do that painting, drawing. You could do that through sculpture, you can do that through music, you can do that through writing. It's just it, at the very beginning of whichever branch you take of that, the idea is there's something that you're trying to express, or there's something you're trying to communicate, and getting in touch with that is is the starting point, and then through whichever medium you're trying to do it, you figure out how to do it. So
like, yeah, like with screenwriting, it's the same way. I have such these complex ideas. You put it all on one draft, and your first goal is to whittle it down, and not necessarily make it overly simple, but like just less complex, more palatable, and obviously, you know, um, abide by screenwriting language. And some of those rules are, malleable, but there are some rules that you definitely have to stick to once you get the ideas down. Um, I don't know if you feel as confined as a composer by rules, or are you able to throw some conventions out the door?
yeah, it depends on the context, but I'd say in general, in just the sense of music making,
Hmm.
absolutely. And that was one of the things that I found very, very, very interesting about film composition, is if you're trying to be an indie musician, you're trying to be a pop musician, and you're making records, it's sometimes you can make something that's completely out of left field and people will respond to it. But for the most part, it's people are very, very conscious of sticking in some certain lane. It needs to sound like a pop song. It needs to sound like an indie record. It needs to sound whatever. In film scoring, there is a lot more room for experimentation. And a lot of times, the weirder you can get with it, the more filmmakers are going to be responsive to it. And then hopefully the audience as well. So I feel like, yes, in a certain regard, there is a lot more freedom to do whatever. And it still passes, or it still makes sense under the banner of film score or film composition. Um, Another interesting thing about what we do when you get on a specific project, though, that's when the box becomes, or that's when the constraints become very important, because you can do whatever, but what is going to most effectively support this story? Um, and even within, you then get into a smaller box, even within the context of the scene. One of the things that I really like about film composition is, although there are, 1,000 ways to skin a cat, or whatever the saying is, a scene is what the scene is, and there might be some choices you can make in what to bring out of that scene musically, or what to play to musically. But certain things are going to feel right, and certain things are not. Like there are right and wrong answers, in my opinion. If it's a very intimate scene and you're playing psycho screechy strings behind it, that is not going to be effective in telling the story that's on screen. So, hope that answered your question. Um,
It totally did. And to, a little bit to that point, you mentioned in the past that you try to incorporate live instruments whenever you can, but do you feel like over the past 20, 40 years, it's moved away from sort of actual physical instruments to digital? And do you think that's a positive thing for more freedom, or is it, you know, more of a negative thing for the industry?
Again, depends on the context. The so and there's a bunch of things to talk about in that concept as well. On the one hand, there's digital digital instruments, like, well, these are analog synths, so they're analog instruments, but they're synthesizers. They're not traditional, you know violins, basses, cellos, guitars, whatever. And then on the purely digital side of just being within a computer, so much of what we do is making mock-ups using sample libraries of recorded, actual recorded violins and cellos and trombones and whatnot, where these companies that put out these sample libraries have these sessions that last for weeks, where you're literally recording every note of the violin with every articulation 5, 10, 15 times. So you have what's called a round robin. So if you hit the same note twice, you're not playing the exact same. And then these get compiled in these libraries where I can sit at my computer and play on the keyboard, and it sounds like a violin playing. So that's basically every score, whether or not it's going to be recorded by live musicians or not, with the exception, I think John Williams is one of the only people that doesn't have to do mock-ups. But that's how it is written. It exists in a mocked up digital version of it before you get to the final recording session at the end. The negative, so on the one hand, it's great because filmmakers can understand what things are, more or less what things are going to sound like before you actually get to the recording session where you're recording a lot of live musicians. The negative aspect of that, though, is people going like, oh, well, the mock-up is just good enough. Using this fake stuff is just good enough. So in that sense of trying to emulate actual human beings playing orchestral instruments in a room, I think that's a negative trend of people being like, oh, well, we can just spend less money and just use these mocked up sample library versions. In terms of using digital tools, computers, synthesizers, crazy effects, that's just another tool in the toolkit for creativity and for expression and for new sounds. But when a human touch is called for, I don't think substituting that with a non-human pastiche of it is the right way to go. So my feelings.
That makes a lot of sense, and it reminds me of that when you say it's another tool in the toolkit, it's an art form in and of itself. It's like you think about what Jay Dilla did, and beginning in the 80s with the 8-track, just making sort of creating hip hop beats his own, and almost creating like a new genre of music, with this slightly offbeat, drums and manipulating of samples. It's incredible what he did. The guy's a genius, but it just reminds me a lot of the composing process too. Like these things they complement each other.
Yeah, and whenever a new technology is introduced, it's a different process. Like interacting, in Jay Dilla's case of like interacting with like an MPC, like that's a different process of expression and musical creation than it would be if he were sitting down at a piano. If he were like writing songs using a piano or like making beats, recording himself like on a piano, it would be a different result. It's just the nature of the interaction with the medium and with the tools. It's going to that difference in process will produce a different result. And that's one of the reasons I feel like a lot of, musicians in general, but definitely film composers, they look like pack rats. You can't really see my full tiny room here, but there's just all sorts of different types of instruments and synthesizers and effects and whatnot, because on the one hand, it's a bit of an obsession and a rabbit hole that's in the nerdy music communities. They call it gear acquisition syndrome. But the way I can justify it is you get so used to doing things in a certain way, and if you force yourself to change the tools with which you're interacting with, the nature of that change, hopefully, but more often than not, is going to elicit a different result, because you're not doing it in exactly the same way you did it the last time. So it's kind of a way to stay fresh and inspired. And yeah.
I recently saw Skull Island and loved it. Loved the whole series.
Thank you.
Score. Yeah. It was. I love the when they expand the mythos of like the under Earth theory, Hollow Earth.
Hollow Earth. Yeah.
I always wanted to ask this question. Is composing in an animated medium different than live action, or is it just purely like genre, tone, character based? Do you keep the same core?
The short answer is The short answer is going to be no, because the animation, you can have a horror animation and you can have a, Looney Tunes animation. So it really depends on what the story is. Like I approached writing for Skull Island no differently than I've approached writing for any other project. Process wise, there are a few differences which we can or cannot go into. I'd actually say you're dealing with picture changes a lot less frequently with animation because it's so expensive to change things. Whereas when you're working on a film, you can be getting a new cut of the film sometimes multiple times a week, like with changes and things have moved over here. And so it's just like, yeah, as a composer, then you got to open up your sessions and conform everything to the new cut. And it's a hassle. It's one of the things that just comes with the job. But yeah, so the lack of picture changes is quite nice. But yeah, in terms of telling the story, it's just whatever it calls for.
And I think to that point, like, let's say you're working on a project. Do you submit like a sample beforehand sometimes, or is it usually required that you have to watch the scene first in order to think of something, or does it start with you reading the script and be like, okay, I got the tone, I know the director's vision, I can already start ideating and maybe provide samples to it?
Yeah, it really depends on the project. The ideal situation is when you're brought on early before the film is even shot, and you've read the script, and then you can just start writing musical ideas. Like if it's you understand the main themes of the film, you understand kind of the different vibes that are going to be needed, and you can start to just write music away from picture that you think is going to hit those vibes. So for Skull Island, actually, I wrote the spoiler alert. The Kraken theme was this. I don't know if you picked up on it, but it was this like motif that kept like repeating.
Yeah.
And I had maybe a 7-minute suite of music that I'd written just for different vibes that I thought would be used when the Kraken appears. And so there's very intimate, mysterious stuff, settings of that theme on a bass flute. There's more horror versions of that are like more aleatoric. There's driving action versions where that theme comes in. And then there's these big, just like epic, tragic, like the biggest version of those. So it's maybe like 5 to 7 minute suite before seeing a frame of picture. And a lot of that, then I was able to, very rarely are you then able to plop that into picture and then it just works. Hans Zimmer being an example, people who've worked with him say he just understands what is going to work so well that a lot of times he's just written stuff without seeing picture and you put it in and it just works. Like it's really, really, really a genius in that regard. So again, looping back to why I try to take so much influence from what he does. This to me is a very Hans Zimmer approach. Is I tried to be like, okay, I'm understand the types of things that are going to be happening around this character. Let me write a big piece of music that tries to like go on all those journeys. And sometimes I was able to plop it in and just change a few things and cut out a bar here and move this over here and it would work. But other times I would have to then spend a lot of time like taking that material I'd already written and like, okay, well, this section is going to need to come a minute later. This section that was 2 minutes later needs to be bumped up against this section. And so it's kind of like building blocks that you can kind of rearrange and then massage in order to get the storytelling right.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating the larger tapestry. And you mentioned Hans Zimmer again. I saw him in concert one time and it's one of the best shows I've ever seen because like you said, when you talk about range, which I'm going to get to with the Gates, it's like I was able to see his entire career from like the early 90s to the stuff he's made in the last few years. And it's just like no single score is sounds, you can tell it's Hans Zimmer, but I mean it's like how do you go from Gladiator to like superhero movies to like quiet uh, more of the intimate stuff that he's done. So that's a great influence to have, obviously. And I see the same sort of range in you, especially after watching Skull Island and The Gates nearly back to back. It's like, um, damn, those are two very different scores that complement the film so much. So
Yeah,
bravo.
well, thank you. Yeah, they're both a lot of fun to work on. Yeah, I'll take that compliment.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, too. So I mean, yeah, it adds to the atmosphere of the film, the Victorian era. Um, and so, like, I imagine you mentioned you recently got into horror too a little bit more. So this must have been just an ideal project and super fun to
oh
work on.
yeah, well, I forgot to mention Mr. Eggers when we were talking about um, filmmakers that we really admire. When I saw The Witch when it came out, that was what opened the door for me. I was like, I had kind of had this conception in my head of horror being, you know, slashers and like jump scares and stuff like that. And when I saw The Witch, I was like, this movie is incredible. The world building, the economy of it, it's just all it's the simplest version of our Western conception of witches. Every trope was there. I don't think there was ever a pointy hat, but literally every other witch trope. Her on the broom in front of or on the stick in front of the moon, the poison apple, the like, it just being confined to a single family, like a witch hunt within that family, and just the costuming, the set designing, music, everything was just so contained in this world. So that was what blew everything up open for me in terms of horror. It was like, oh wait, horror does not necessarily mean like campy slasher. And so that's when I started like, you know, going back and like watching all the classics and watching every new horror film. Like my watch list is it's basically just all horror. Those are like all the films I'm excited to see with, you know, and like Oppenheimer and the new Dune movie and stuff like that. But other than that, it's basically all horror.
Oh yeah, man. My brother and I, that's like our favorite thing to do. When we hang out, it's like, what horror movie are we going to watch? You know, and it's usually indie horror because we love indie movies, or indie horror. And I don't get me wrong, I love mainstream horror too, but yeah,
what
we
was
tend
one of
to
the
watch the hidden gems. We've
Yeah.
been watching a lot of found footage
Okay.
projects lately, like, and we even seek out the worst. Like, let's just like see which one got the worst reviews, and like we watch it, and we just be like, this is fucking awesome. Like, are you kidding me? Like, because you don't have expectations, and you don't have to like overanalyze certain parts of it. And then there's the more horror that adds social commentary that, you know, really is a tool to say something about our society.
Yeah. I mean, it's impossible to talk about found footage horror without bringing up Paranormal Activity.
Right.
I rewatched Paranormal Activity recently and was blown away. Again, speaking of economy, within the first 30 seconds of the film, so much information comes to you and it doesn't feel like exposition. You get the whole setup of everything within 30 seconds of what sound like little throwaway, like, you know, not important lines. Everything is there in the first 30 seconds. Maybe it was like 45 seconds or a minute, but it's just so it kind of like blew my mind. It was like, it's all right here. Like we're a minute into the movie and everything is right here. Like it was fantastic.
Oh yeah, I watched that in theaters, and I have this thing where when I get scared, tears just come out of my eyes. The whole time I was just like streaming down my face. My friends going like, "Are you okay, man?" And I'm like, "I'm just
No,
scared."
this is great. This is
Yeah,
great.
this is amazing. um, but you know, I mentioned this earlier about I think the link to the grounded in realism that the Gates has, to sort of contrast the occult theme. Um, and it seems like horror scores might inform the tone of the film a little more than most genres. I don't know what your opinion is on that. Like, each flourish and note, and embellish in this score is so precise And, I think particularly with the horror genre, if it doesn't have the right score, it can totally take away from the building of an atmosphere and terror in whatever form that is. What
It's
do you
all, yeah, it's all, horror is all tension. And so if something is slightly too early or slightly too late, you've broken the tension. Or it's so, yeah, and a lot of times the less you do, the more tense it's going to be. But it's like you can't completely disappear, but it is a very, very, very fine balance. And I got the co-composer on the film, Max. I got to give him most of the credit for how this score turned out. This actually started as his film and his score, and we're collaborators. We've collaborated on a ton of projects over the years. But I came in maybe like halfway through the process, so he'd already established like a language, and then together, kind of what I brought to the table once that language was established was more of these little detail oriented moments. It's like he nailed the vibe. He got the palette and he got the vibe down, and then it became taking what that vibe he had established, and using that and molding it to really bring out more of the storytelling. And yeah, I think that answered the question.
And it's not so much like an oratorio as it is like a contained like nod to that era of music, which was already nostalgic for simpler times because of such drastic changes that were coming around in the late 19th century. Harmonies, the inextricable link to religion, the sort of, the piano, which is extremely prominent in orchestra during that time period. I just found all these little hints to that era of music, and I'm wondering if that was something that was in you guys' mind.
Oh, absolutely.
Incorporating setting, right, has to be considered.
We were very, very conscious, very, very conscious of the palette being. We wanted to sound like, even though the style of writing and the way the instruments were used is not something that would have been appropriate for music of that time, we wanted the actual sound of the instruments. So it's mostly all just acoustic, violin, cello, double bass, piano, harp, and then some found objects that were recorded and heavily manipulated. But we wanted the baseline of the palette to be tied to what would have been musically appropriate for that era. And then because there is this supernatural element, we then heavily distort and manipulate a lot of those elements to bring that level of aggression. And we were very, very conscious. Both Max and I love electronic music and love using synthesizers, and that's kind of our go-to when we're doing more aggressive stuff. And on this one specifically, we're like, none of that. The use of electricity in this film is literally going to be that electricity, like the electric chair. That is going to be the electrical component of this film, and everything that we're going to do, we're going to try to root in a more organic world. I forgot to. Bass clarinet also plays a big role as one of the instruments I forgot. So we wanted to kind of juxtapose our organic, even though it's heavily manipulated, organic instrumental sound against this other character of electricity that's being introduced into the world.
Wow. So is that sort of ominous humming in the background? Is that often the bass clarinet?
Oh, that's actually probably me actually humming.
Oh, really?
I recorded some vocals on the score, and then pitched them down and spread them all around. Layered myself a million times.
Awesome.
There is bass clarinet, but it's usually pretty recognizable as a bass clarinet until the climax of the movie. There's something that actually, if you're listening to it, you're like, I thought they said they didn't use synths. There's something that sounds like a pretty aggressive, distorted synth. It's a bass clarinet, heavily distorted, layered with another bass clarinet that was pitched an octave down. There are things that sound like electric guitars, which are double basses run through guitar amps. I guess you run anything through a guitar amp, it's going to sound like an electric guitar. But again, it was important to us, even if where you end up is a different place and evoking all these things, it's important. It was important to us to start from a place of organicism.
Yeah. And do you make your own music? You mentioned you like to you were constantly writing in college already and playing around. So is that something that you've done?
Yeah, I haven't released anything though. It's always kind of been the mistress project. So I do quite honestly, for the last many years, I've been so busy doing film. I haven't really had time to do just music for me and like work on an album. But I have a folder on my computer that has a bunch of started songs, ideas, sketches, whatever. It's I don't even know what kind of genre to call it. It's so at some point, yes, I will release some of my own music, but who knows when that will be? I hope sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's a balancing act,
Yeah.
Personal and professional projects for sure. And do you mentioned some of your favorite filmmakers. Do you have a dream filmmaker to work with, or let's to keep it as a to not go into laundry list territory. Let's say like top 3.
Yeah, definitely. I always forget. Is it Roger or Robert Eggers? I'm so embarrassed now. I always whichever one I choose is always the wrong one.
I think it's Robert.
It's Robert, right? Robert Eggers. Yeah, I love the world building he does and the way that he tells stories. That's definitely a dream collab. Like I would be over the moon. Ari Aster I'd mentioned before, but he's got such a good working relationship with Mr. Krillick that those are one of those things that's like if a filmmaker and a composer have a good thing going, like I want to admire them from afar. It's almost like having a crush on someone who like ends up getting in a relationship with very healthy relationship. It's like definitely got a crush on you, but you got a good thing going, and I don't want to mess that up. Like. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ari Aster's work. Yeah, those are the top 2 I'd say right now. Beyond that, it's like what really excites me is working with a person whose work I haven't seen yet, like the young filmmaker who's got a lot to say and a lot of talent that I haven't seen, or that their work has yet to come out. Like that's who I'm most excited to work with.
Hell yeah, I love that, because you're like investing your time in their vision because you believe in it, and it's like you're excited to see where they go next too. Is the great thing. So I've heard that actually from a lot of people in this industry, that they actually really enjoy working with first time directors, and people whose work they haven't seen. Maybe not always first time, but just whose work they aren't familiar with. And I think
there's
a testament to trying to constantly creatively push yourself, right?
Yeah, it's we're required as film composers, we are required to write a lot of music, on just a lot of music. It's a lot of music, and so you sometimes will find yourself, as hard as you try, you're trying to keep things fresh, but you will. Sometimes I find myself like I feel like I've written this cue like 20 times before. Like I'm going from this chord to this chord, and it's like just finding ways to make it fresh, even though you're still like you're pulling from the same experiences and the same sensibilities. And working with new people encourages you to try things in a new way. I just had something that was going to be so profound and it lost my head. It flew out of my head. and yeah, and another thing with working, like in a way, it's fun to work with people who are a bit like naive in the process as well, because they're not just like drawing on, well, this is the way I've always done it, this is how I do these scenes. Like it really, approaching it with that level of naive ignorance can be incredibly, and I don't mean that in any negative way. Like take that term naive ignorance in the most positive, like it just, that is like real creation. You're not drawing on, well, I know exactly how to do this because I've done it
Right.
20 times before. It's really like, it really is creating, because you're stepping off into the unknown, into a territory that you're not really know how to do this, and something hopefully cool comes out the other end.
And it almost makes it more collaborative. You got people asking
Yeah.
questions, being vulnerable, like, hey, do you think this looks or sounds right? Right. It's a lot of that, which I think is always appreciated when someone is asked from, the captain of a project, like to lend their voice or their opinion. Makes you feel even more sort of intermeshed into the group effort that is filmmaking.
Yeah. It's actually, it's funny you say that. There have been some times with younger filmmakers where, um, not, if there's any composers listening to this, I'm not suggesting this becomes the norm, but there have been times where we're working on a scene and I'll realize that, like, oh, well, we are trying to achieve X goal, and I can do this musically, but actually, like, I noticed, I think if the edit was slightly tweaked here, what we're trying to achieve with music to like kind of make this band-aid would actually like be better served in the edit, and then music, you can do this. And it's like, if you're working on a project with Christopher Nolan or something like that, you're gonna give the director editing notes. Like, I don't fucking think so. But like, when you do have that more of a, like, everyone's just kind of figuring this out together, it's a lot more like casual young filmmaker vibe. Like, there have been times when I have made those suggestions and they've been listened to and they've been implemented, and it worked. And it was like, then it really did feel like that collaborative environment. And again, I'm not saying composers start giving edit notes or story notes or anything like that, but it just speaks to that testament of when a collaboration is working really, really well. There's I'm sure other aspects of this industry say this all the time, but one of the things I've heard composers and whatnot in this industry say is, in Hollywood, everybody knows their department, everybody knows their skill and music. Like, everyone has opinions when it comes to music and how they think it should be done.
And how does it work when you have a composer and a music supervisor who's getting other artists, like, songs, like a pop song or a rock song in the movie? Like, do you collaborate with the music supervisor, or
Yeah, if there is so yeah, in general, those are two like very separate jobs. The composer's there to write music for the original score for the film. The music supervisor is there to find pre-existing songs for parts of the film that where a song would be appropriate, a lot of time for the end credits, and also to find an artist sometime to write an original song, whether to be in the film or to be in the end credits. And sometimes that overlaps with the composer, because the composer will work with the artist or provide some material like a main theme of the film that the artist will then use as a starting point, and it becomes, and then maybe the composer will then write some string parts over it. So that's when that can all become like very collaborative. But in just your general run of the mill, a lot of times they're just kind of separate jobs. The music supervisor's working on finding and clearing songs. The composer's off, writing music for the film.
And did you ever see Swiss Army Man?
I never saw Swiss Army Man, but I've listened to the score many times because it has been referenced on a few projects that I've worked with. That was the Daniels, right? That was their movie.
That was the Daniels. Yeah, that was
before everything.
Yeah. And I love that. You've listened to it, but I love that score because of the Daniels helped contribute to it a bit. So to your point about, like, everyone in the industry knows their job and music. But it seems like it was a collaborative effort as well between the actors. You had Paul Dano and Daniel Radcliffe singing on the songs, and they even do a cappella Jurassic Park cover. You know, it's
Forgot about that. Yeah.
how would something
Better.
sorry, say again.
I was gonna say much better than my version from earlier in this conversation.
No, it's dun, dun, dun. No, I think yeah.
Oh, that one. Yeah.
It's
But yeah, just speaking more to the process too. It's when you're a composer, when you're signing onto a film, uh, obviously the music is in your world, and you're going to be putting your mark and your expression toward it. But it is being guided by the director, and it is being guided by the story. So that is a very, very important part of the collaboration. And we've talked about, musical artists, indie artists moving into this world. And I've seen a lot of people not really understand that and have an issue with that. You take an artist who spent years, writing albums and writing their songs. The buck stops with them. They decide if it's good or not. They decide if I like it or not. Maybe if you have a label involved, you're getting a little bit of input. For the most part, you're the artist, you're doing the thing. Then all of a sudden you switch into filmmaking, and you meet with the director, and they say, they give you the movie, and you start writing the scenes. And you're like, oh yeah, this is great. I love this music. This is perfect. You present it to the director, and all of a sudden the director goes, yeah, I don't really know if this is working. Let's change this. You're going, what do you mean? Like, you're going to tell me to change like it's such a different thing to have your baby, your creative baby presented to someone, and then be like, I don't really like this. We need to change that. We need to change that. That is a very, very different mindset that a lot of people have trouble stepping into for the first time.
Yeah, I could imagine, because I would feel like the same way. You just created something, birthed something, and you have to, you know, be able to take, not necessarily, well, it's rejection in a way, but yeah, you have to take constructive criticism and rejection. And when it comes to like your baby, that can be hard to do, right? I mean, it's
Oh yeah, but you got to learn to kill that part of you
yes,
very, very quick if you want to make. And it's not to say you don't have any sort of emotional attachment to it. What you are presenting to the filmmakers, it needs to move you in a way that when you watch the scene, you're like, yeah, I'm invested in the scene. I'm invested in these characters. This feels good to me emotionally. But if it doesn't feel that way to someone else, you need to be receptive to that information and try to figure out. You listen to what they're saying and figure out why.
absolutely. And especially if you trust the director, which, I mean, it seems like you pick projects with directors that you trust, like you said, and whose vision you want to invest in. So coming up ahead, what projects do you have in the pipeline?
So I am getting started on two features right now, two indie features, both comedies actually. Can't really give too many details about either of them yet. One is more of like an action comedy, and the other is kind of like a throwback, a lot of references to the 90s, like as if you were making a 90s comedy. It's kind of a fish out of water story. So there's this dichotomy of like Gen X to Gen Z is kind of like a big, it's fish out of water 90s references in today's context. So that's another one of the projects I'm working on. And then yeah, there's a short film that'll be coming down the pipeline in a bit. That's an animated short film, which I'm very excited for, with a recognizable IP. So that'll be fun to get out in the world. And then beyond that, another animated project. I'm not the composer on, but I've been listed to help work on some of the songs for a big an animated feature that should be coming out in, I think 2025 is the current release date, and it's kind of in the vein of Prince of Egypt. It's like an animated like biblical epic. So that's what I've been working on the last few days, and that's what I'll be working on when we're done chatting. So that's been a lot of fun as well.
You mentioned 90s project. This will be like my last sort of sentiment. Isn't it kind of funny how the 90s are now like becoming more of a staple for nostalgia? It's always been
Oh
kind of
yeah.
the 80s, right? Like, or a time period which you never even lived in. But 90s are really making a comeback, you know, the
Oh,
romantic,
absolutely. I mean, I
everything.
would even say the early 2000s are making a comeback
Yeah.
right now too, with like pop punk is making a comeback. Like it's just look 25, 30 years, whatever that, how long ago that was, that is going to be what is making a comeback in terms of nostalgia. Cause you get the, the generation that's coming of age is going to be nostalgic for this period that they never lived for. That was like right before anything that they remember. And the cycle will continue to perpetuate itself, I imagine, to the end of time.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like hauntology, constantly longing for a simpler time that never really existed, and imagining, you know, futures based on previous behaviors that have always failed. Like, yeah, not to get into philosophy, but I call that, or it's
Hey,
called
why not? Yeah.
ontology. Yeah,
Ontology. I like that.
they say it's going to replace ontology. So, like, I don't know if that's going to like coincide with the singularity or what. You know, thank you so much for joining my podcast. I really appreciate your time. I mean, I know how busy you are, but like, man, uh, yeah, your answers were outstanding, and it's been great hearing about more of the process of composing.
I mean, thanks for having me, man. This is a lot of fun to, as you may have been able to tell, I really enjoy talking about this kind of stuff.
As you should, yeah.
Yeah,
That's why
almost as much as doing it. Well, sometimes more, but
yeah. That's why we do it. That's why we do it.
yeah.
That was Jason Lazarus on Shattering Superstructure, and this is Alex Arabian signing off. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time.